Diana Foster had lived in Riverside for 8 years, and in all that time, most people knew only three things about her. She was 62, she lived alone in the small house on Maple Street, and she kept to herself. She worked part-time at the local bookstore, spent her evenings reading, and on weekends could often be seen walking along the river that gave the town its name. What they didn't know was that Diana Foster had once been Diana Foster Martinez, one of the most feared corporate attorneys on the East Coast. For 25 years, she had fought legal battles that made headlines, representing whistleblowers against powerful corporations, taking on cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch. She had been known for her sharp mind, her relentless preparation, and her ability to find the one piece of evidence that could bring down seemingly untouchable opponents. But that was before everything fell apart, before the case that went too far, before she lost everything that mattered and decided that some battles weren't worth winning. Now, on this quiet Tuesday morning in October, Diana was arranging new arrivals in the bookstore when she heard shouting from across the street. Through the large front window, she could see a small crowd gathering outside Fletcher's hardware store. At the center of the commotion was Harold Fletcher himself, a 78-year-old man who had run the hardware store for 40 years and was as much a part of Riverside as the river itself. Harold was arguing with two men in expensive suits. Even from a distance, Diana could see that Harold was upset, his usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious distress. One of the suited men was holding a thick folder of papers, pointing at them aggressively, while Harold shook his head. Diana's first instinct was to look away. She had learned over the past 8 years that the best way to maintain her peaceful life was to avoid getting involved in other people's problems. But something about Harold's posture, the way his shoulders seemed to shrink under the pressure of whatever those men were telling him, made her pause. The argument continued for several more minutes before the two men got into a black sedan and drove away, leaving Harold standing alone on the sidewalk, staring down at a piece of paper in his hands. Several neighbors approached him, but after brief conversations, they walked away, looking concerned and helpless. Diana finished her work in silence, but throughout the day, she found herself glancing across the street at the hardware store. By closing time, she had made a decision she thought she would never make again. She was going to ask questions. That evening, Diana walked across the street and found Harold in his store, slowly organizing inventory with the mechanical movements of someone trying to keep their hands busy. The usually bright and welcoming shop felt different somehow, heavier. "Hello, Harold," Diana said gently. Harold looked up, clearly surprised. Diana rarely shopped at the hardware store, and they had never had more than brief, polite conversations. "Oh, hello, Diana. Store's officially closed, but if you need something urgent—" "I don't need anything," Diana said. "I saw what happened this morning. You seemed upset." Harold's face tightened. He set down the box of screws he had been sorting and leaned against the counter. For a moment, Diana thought he might tell her it was none of her business. Instead, he sighed deeply. "Lawyers," he said, as if the word itself tasted bitter. "They're saying I owe money I don't owe on property I own free and clear. They're saying if I don't pay, they'll take the store." Diana felt something cold settle in her stomach. What kind of lawyers? "Some firm called Davidson and Associates. They say my father borrowed money back in 1987, using the store as collateral. They say he never paid it back, and now they want the full amount plus interest. $60,000. "Did your father borrow that money?" Harold shook his head firmly. "My father paid off every debt he ever had before he died in 1995. I have the documents. But these lawyers, they have papers too, and they say theirs are more official." Diana had heard stories like this before. During her legal career, She had seen various forms of deed fraud, document manipulation, and predatory lending schemes that targeted elderly property owners. But she had also learned to be careful about getting involved without knowing all the facts. Have you shown their documents to a lawyer? I went to Peterson and Sons down on Main Street. Bill Peterson looked at everything and said it seems legitimate. Said I should probably just pay it to avoid a long legal fight. Harold's voice was barely above a whisper. Diana, I don't have $60,000, and even if I did, I know this isn't right. My father would never have put the store at risk like that. Diana nodded slowly. Every instinct she had developed over 25 years of legal practice was telling her that Harold was being targeted by professionals who knew exactly how to make fraudulent claims look legitimate to small-town lawyers who didn't specialize in complex fraud cases. Harold, she said carefully, would you mind if I looked at those documents? Harold studied her face for a moment. You're not a lawyer, are you? The question hung in the air between them. Diana had spent 8 years carefully avoiding this moment, this choice between her old life and her new one. She could tell Harold she wasn't a lawyer, wish him luck, and walk away. She could maintain the quiet, simple life she had built for herself. Instead, she said, I used to be. Harold's eyes widened slightly. What kind of lawyer? The kind who fought people like Davidson and Associates. The next morning, Diana sat at Harold's kitchen table in the small apartment above the hardware store, surrounded by papers. Harold had given her copies of everything: the documents from Davidson and Associates, his father's old financial records, property deeds, and the brief analysis from Peterson and Sons. It took Diana less than an hour to identify the first red flag. The loan document from Davidson and Associates was dated October 15, 1987, and claimed to be signed by Harold's father, William Fletcher. But Diana had also found William Fletcher's real signature on a dozen different documents from the same time period, and the signatures didn't match. More importantly, the supposed loan agreement contained legal language that hadn't been commonly used until the 1990s. Diana pulled out her laptop, which she rarely used for anything more complicated than reading news or ordering books online, and began to research Davidson and Associates. What she found made her jaw tighten with familiar anger. Davidson and Associates wasn't just a law firm. They were part of a larger network of companies that specialized in what the legal world politely called distressed asset acquisition. What it actually meant was that they identified elderly property owners in small towns, created fraudulent debt claims against their properties, and then used aggressive legal tactics to force quick settlements or property transfers. According to the court records Diana found online, Davidson and Associates had been involved in over 200 similar cases across 3 states in the past 5 years. In most cases, property owners had paid settlements rather than fight lengthy legal battles they couldn't afford. But Diana also found something else. In the few cases where Davidson and Associates had been challenged by experienced attorneys, their documents had fallen apart under scrutiny. The problem was that most small-town lawyers didn't have the resources or expertise to conduct the kind of detailed investigation needed to expose the fraud. Diana leaned back in her chair and stared at the papers spread across Harold's table. She had found enough evidence in one morning to prove that Davidson and Associates was trying to steal Harold's property. The question was what to do about it. She could give Harold her findings and suggest he take them to a more experienced attorney in the state capitol. She could help him understand what questions to ask and what evidence to demand. She could point him in the right direction and then step back into her quiet life. Or she could do what she had once been very, very good at. Diana made her choice when Harold returned from the store that afternoon. He looked older than his 78 years, worn down by stress and worry. When he asked if she had found anything useful, Diana looked him in the eye and said, "Harold, how would you feel about fighting back?" "What do you mean?" "I mean that Davidson and Associates is trying to steal your property with forged documents and fraudulent claims. And I mean that I know how to stop them." Harold sat down heavily at the table. "Diana, I appreciate everything you're doing, but I can't afford to hire a big city lawyer. Peterson already told me that fighting this could cost more than just paying them." "You're not hiring a big city lawyer," Diana said quietly. "I'm offering to represent you myself." "But you said you used to be a lawyer. Don't you need to be active, licensed?" Diana smiled for the first time in days. "I never let my license expire, Harold. I just stopped practicing. There's a difference." That afternoon, Diana walked into the offices of Davidson and Associates, located in a gleaming building 30 miles outside of Riverside. She had spent 2 hours preparing for this meeting, putting on a business suit she hadn't worn in 8 years, and mentally shifting back into the mindset that had once made her one of the most effective attorneys on the East Coast. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a practiced smile, looked up as Diana entered. "Good afternoon. Do you have an appointment?" "No appointment," Diana said calmly. "Please tell Mr. Davidson that Diana Foster is here regarding the Fletcher matter." The receptionist's smile faltered slightly. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Davidson only meets by appointment. If you'd like to schedule..." "Please tell Mr. Davidson that if he doesn't see me in the next 5 minutes, he'll be seeing me in federal court next week." The receptionist's eyes widened. She picked up her phone and spoke in hushed tones for a moment, then hung up and gestured toward a hallway. "Mr. Davidson will see you now." Robert Davidson was a man in his 50s with silver hair and expensive clothes that were meant to project success and authority. His office was decorated with plaques and awards, most of them related to real estate and business development, rather than legal practice. He gestured for Diana to sit in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "Ms. Foster, I understand you represent Mr. Fletcher in our collection matter." "That's correct." "Well, I'm sure we can work something out. These kinds of disputes are always unfortunate, but the debt is clearly documented. Perhaps we could arrange a payment plan." Diana opened her briefcase and placed a thick folder on Davidson's desk. "Mr. Davidson, that folder contains copies of every case your firm has filed in the past 5 years, along with detailed analysis of your documentation patterns, signature comparisons, and timeline inconsistencies. It also contains evidence that your firm has been systematically targeting elderly property owners with fraudulent debt claims." Davidson's confident expression began to change. "Ms. Foster, I don't know what you think you found, but I think I've found a criminal conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and theft." Diana's voice remained perfectly calm. "The loan document you claim William Fletcher signed in 1987 contains legal language that wasn't in common use until 1995. The signature is an obvious forgery, and the notary who supposedly witnessed the signing has been dead since 1985. Davidson reached for the folder, but Diana placed her hand on it first. "You have 2 choices, Mr. Davidson. You can withdraw your claim against Mr. Fletcher immediately and agree never to contact him again. Or I can file criminal complaints with the State Attorney General's office, the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, and the State Bar Association, along with a federal lawsuit that will expose every fraudulent case your firm has filed. You can't prove..." "I can prove all of it." Diana opened the folder and showed Davidson the first page, which contained a side-by-side comparison of William Fletcher's real signature and the forged version. "I spent 25 years fighting people exactly like you, Mr. Davidson. I know how to dismantle fraudulent schemes, and I know how to make sure the people responsible face consequences." Davidson stared at the signature comparison for a long moment, then looked up at Diana with the expression she had seen many times before on the faces of people who suddenly realized they were outmatched. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that you sign a document withdrawing all claims against Harold Fletcher and agreeing never to contact him again. In exchange, I won't file the criminal complaints I've already prepared." "And if I refuse?" Diana smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. "Then you'll discover why I used to be very expensive." 30 minutes later, Diana walked out of Davidson and Associates with a signed agreement withdrawing all claims against Harold Fletcher. But she wasn't finished. That evening, she called the state attorney general's office and spoke with a prosecutor she had worked with years earlier. She explained Davidson and Associates' pattern of fraud and provided copies of all her evidence. She also contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and the State Bar Association. By the end of the week, Davidson and Associates was under investigation by 3 different agencies. Within a month, Robert Davidson and 2 of his associates were facing criminal charges. And within 6 months, more than 50 elderly property owners across 3 states had received notification that fraudulent claims against their properties had been withdrawn. But for Diana, the most important moment came 3 days after her meeting with Davidson, when Harold Fletcher reopened his hardware store with a smile on his face and a spring in his step that she hadn't seen since the day the lawyers first appeared. "I don't know how to thank you," Harold said, as Diana stopped by to pick up some gardening supplies. "You don't need to thank me," Diana replied. "You just needed someone who knew how to fight back." As Diana walked home that evening, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 8 years: the satisfaction of using her skills to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves. She had spent nearly a decade trying to forget who she used to be, but helping Harold had reminded her that some parts of her old life were worth remembering. Word of what had happened spread quickly through Riverside, as news always did in small towns. Diana found herself receiving visits from other residents who had legal questions or problems they didn't know how to handle. Most were small matters that she could resolve with a phone call or a strongly worded letter. But some were more serious. Margaret Wilson, an 85-year-old widow, discovered that a contractor had been systematically overcharging her for home repairs and had filed fake liens against her property when she questioned the bills. Diana helped Margaret file complaints with the state contractor licensing board and recover the money she had been overcharged. The Rodriguez family learned that their son's college had been reporting false information to financial aid agencies, causing their son to lose his scholarship. Diana spent 2 weeks navigating education bureaucracy until the scholarship was restored, and the college agreed to pay the family's out-of-pocket expenses. A group of local small business owners discovered that they had been paying fees to a fake small business association that provided no actual services. Diana helped them file a class action lawsuit that shut down the scam and recovered their money. Each case was different, but they all had something in common: people who needed help but didn't know where to find it, facing problems that seemed too big or too complicated to solve alone. Diana found herself working more hours than she had since her retirement, but for the first time in years, the work felt meaningful. She wasn't fighting for corporations or wealthy clients who could afford to hire teams of lawyers. She was fighting for people like Harold Fletcher, ordinary people who deserved protection from those who would take advantage of them. 6 months after the Davidson and Associates case, Diana made a decision that surprised even herself. She rented a small office above the bakery on Main Street and hung out a simple sign: "Diana Foster, Attorney at Law." On her first official day back in practice, Harold Fletcher was her first visitor. He didn't have a legal problem this time. He just wanted to bring her a cup of coffee and a muffin from the bakery downstairs. "I heard you're making it official," he said, settling into one of the second-hand chairs Diana had bought for her waiting area. "It seems like Riverside needs a lawyer who fights for the right people," Diana replied. Harold smiled. "I think Riverside is lucky to have you." As Harold left, Diana sat in her small office and looked out the window at the town that had become her home. For 8 years, she had tried to hide from her past, to build a life without conflict or complexity. But she had learned something important in fighting Davidson and Associates. Running away from who you used to be didn't make you a different person. It just made you a person who wasn't using their gifts. Diana Foster had spent 25 years fighting for justice in boardrooms and courtrooms where millions of dollars were at stake. Now she was fighting for justice in a small town where the stakes were more personal but no less important. A hardware store that represented a man's life work, a widow's home, a young person's education, a family's financial security. The work was different, but the principle was the same. Everyone deserved someone who would fight for them when they couldn't fight for themselves. That afternoon, Diana received a call from a woman in the next town over. The woman had heard about Harold Fletcher's case and wondered if Diana might be able to help with a similar problem. A company was claiming her late husband had owed money on a loan she had never heard of, and local lawyers had told her she should probably just pay it rather than fight. Diana smiled as she scheduled an appointment for the next day. It seemed that Davidson and Associates hadn't been the only company running fraudulent debt schemes in small towns, and it seemed that Diana Foster had found her purpose again. "Don't worry," Diana told the woman on the phone. "I know exactly how to handle people like that." As she hung up the phone, Diana realized that coming home to Riverside hadn't been about running away from her past after all. It had been about finding her way back to the person she was meant to be. Someone who fought for people who needed fighting for. Someone who used her skills to protect rather than to profit. Someone who understood that the most important battles weren't always the biggest ones. Diana Foster was 62 years old, and she was just getting started. Over the following months, Diana's practice grew steadily. Word spread not just through Riverside, but to surrounding communities as well. People drove from towns 50 miles away to consult with the lawyer who had taken down Davidson and Associates, and who seemed to specialize in cases that other attorneys wouldn't touch. Diana discovered that the problems she had uncovered weren't limited to fraudulent debt collection. Elder abuse took many forms: fake charity scams, identity theft, predatory lending, and unscrupulous contractors who targeted elderly homeowners. She also found that many of the schemes specifically targeted small towns where residents were less likely to have access to experienced legal help. But Diana also discovered something else. She wasn't fighting alone. 6 months after opening her practice, she received a call from another attorney, James Wright, who practiced in a town about 100 miles away. Wright had heard about Diana's work and wanted to share information about similar cases in his area. "I've been seeing the same patterns you described in the Davidson case," Wright told her during their first phone conversation. "Fake debt collectors, forged documents, targeting elderly property owners. But I haven't had the resources to investigate the way you did." Diana shared her research methods and evidence-gathering techniques with Wright, and together they began to identify connections between different fraudulent schemes operating across the region. They discovered that Davidson and Associates had been part of a much larger network of companies, all using similar tactics in different geographic areas. Working together, Diana and Wright were able to build cases that shut down 3 more fraudulent debt collection operations and helped dozens of victims recover their money and their property. Their success led to more attorneys reaching out for help and information. Within a year, Diana found herself part of an informal network of lawyers who specialized in protecting elderly clients from financial predators. They shared research, coordinated investigations, and supported each other's cases. Diana's role in the network was unique. While most of the other attorneys worked in larger cities and handled multiple types of cases, Diana's focus on small-town practice gave her insights into how fraudulent schemes specifically targeted rural communities. Her background in complex commercial litigation also gave her skills that many of the other attorneys lacked. But perhaps most importantly, Diana brought something to the network that couldn't be taught: the determination of someone who had found her purpose after years of searching for it. 2 years after the Davidson case, Diana received a call that would test everything she had learned about fighting financial predators. The caller was Susan Walsh, an 89-year-old woman from a town called Millfield, about 60 miles from Riverside. "Ms. Foster," Susan said, her voice shaky but determined, "I heard you help people like me, people who are being cheated." Diana listened as Susan explained her situation. A company called Heritage Financial Services was claiming that Susan's late husband had taken out a reverse mortgage on their home before his death 3 years earlier. Heritage was demanding immediate payment of $180,000, or they would foreclose on the house where Susan had lived for 45 years. The problem was that Susan was certain her husband had never taken out a reverse mortgage. They had owned their home free and clear for over 20 years, and her husband had been strongly opposed to any kind of debt. But Heritage had documents that appeared official, and they had already filed foreclosure proceedings. "Ms. Foster," Susan said, "I don't have that kind of money, and I don't have anywhere else to go. This house is all I have left." Diana agreed to meet with Susan the next day. As she drove to Millfield, she felt the familiar combination of anger and determination that had powered her through her most difficult cases. If Heritage Financial Services was running the same kind of fraud as Davidson and Associates, she would stop them. But this case felt different, more urgent. Susan Walsh wasn't just facing financial loss. She was facing the possibility of losing her home and having nowhere to go. Millfield was smaller than Riverside, with a population of less than 2,000 people. Susan Walsh lived in a modest house on a quiet street lined with mature oak trees. When Diana knocked on the door, it was opened by a small, silver-haired woman with bright blue eyes and a determined expression. "You must be Miss Foster," Susan said, inviting Diana inside. "Thank you for coming." Susan's house was neat and comfortable, filled with photographs and mementos from a long life. On the kitchen table, she had laid out all the documents related to Heritage Financial Services' claim. Diana spent an hour reviewing the paperwork while Susan made tea and told her about her late husband, Robert. They had been married for 52 years. Robert had been a mechanic who built his own garage and took pride in never owing money to anyone. When he was diagnosed with cancer 3 years earlier, he had insisted on paying all his medical bills in cash rather than taking on debt. Robert would never have taken out a reverse mortgage, Susan said firmly. Never. He didn't even like credit cards. Diana examined the documents from Heritage Financial Services. They appeared more sophisticated than the Davidson and Associates papers had been. The reverse mortgage agreement looked professional, with proper formatting and legal language. But Diana had learned to look deeper than surface appearances. She found the first problem in the notarization. The document claimed to have been notarized on March 15, 2019, by a notary public named Linda Morrison. But when Diana called the State Notary Commission, she learned that Linda Morrison's notary license had expired in 2018 and had never been renewed. The second problem was in the timing. The reverse mortgage agreement was dated 6 months after Robert Walsh had been admitted to hospice care with advanced cancer. Medical records that Susan provided showed that Robert had been heavily medicated and largely unresponsive during that time period. But the third problem was the most telling. Diana used her laptop to research Heritage Financial Services and discovered that the company had been incorporated just 2 years earlier. But the reverse mortgage documents were dated 3 years ago, before the company had legally existed. Diana looked up from her laptop to find Susan watching her anxiously. "What did you find?" Susan asked. "I found that Heritage Financial Services is trying to steal your house with forged documents," Diana said, "and I found that they made some very stupid mistakes in the process." Susan's face showed a mixture of relief and anger. "What can we do about it?" Diana smiled grimly. "We can fight back." The next morning, Diana called Heritage Financial Services and asked to speak with whoever was handling the Walsh foreclosure. She was transferred to a man named Kevin Phillips, who spoke in the kind of aggressive tone that was meant to intimidate people into compliance. "Ms. Foster, the documentation is clear," Phillips said. "Mr. Walsh signed a valid reverse mortgage agreement, and the debt is now due in full. Mrs. Walsh can either pay the amount owed or face foreclosure." "Mr. Phillips," Diana said calmly, "I'm calling to inform you that Mrs. Walsh is represented by counsel and that your company's claim against her property is fraudulent." "That's a serious accusation, Ms. Foster. Do you have evidence to support it?" "I have evidence that your reverse mortgage document was supposedly notarized by someone whose license had expired. I have evidence that the document is dated after your company was incorporated. And I have evidence that Robert Walsh was in hospice care and incapable of signing legal documents at the time your agreement is dated." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Philip said, "Perhaps there's been some confusion. These matters can be complicated. Maybe we could work out some kind of settlement. The only settlement I'm interested in is your company withdrawing its fraudulent claim and agreeing never to contact Mrs. Walsh again," Diana said. "You have 48 hours to provide written confirmation that the foreclosure has been dismissed. If I don't receive that confirmation, I'll be filing criminal complaints and a federal lawsuit. Ms. Foster, I think you're being hasty. Why don't we schedule a meeting to discuss this matter reasonably?" Diana had heard this approach before. Fraudulent companies often tried to buy time and create confusion when their schemes were exposed. The goal was to wear down victims and their attorneys until they agreed to some kind of settlement that legitimized the fraudulent claim. "Mr. Phillips," Diana said, 48 hours. She hung up the phone and immediately began preparing the criminal complaints she had threatened to file. Based on her research, Heritage Financial Services was running a more sophisticated version of the same scheme as Davidson and Associates. They were targeting elderly homeowners whose spouses had recently died, creating fake reverse mortgage claims, and using aggressive foreclosure tactics to force quick settlements. But Diana had also discovered something else during her research. Heritage Financial Services was connected to at least 6 other companies that were running similar schemes across 4 states. This wasn't just a local fraud operation. It was a regional network that had been systematically targeting vulnerable elderly people for several years. Diana spent the rest of the day contacting the attorneys in her network, sharing information about Heritage Financial Services, and coordinating a response. By evening, she had spoken with lawyers in 3 states who were representing clients with similar claims from related companies. It was becoming clear that this case would be bigger than Davidson and Associates had been. But Diana was no longer working alone. 48 hours later, Diana had not received any communication from Heritage Financial Services. As promised, she filed criminal complaints with the State Attorney General's office and the FBI. She also filed a federal lawsuit on behalf of Susan Walsh, claiming fraud, elder abuse, and violations of federal consumer protection laws. But Diana also did something else. Working with the other attorneys in her network, she filed a class action lawsuit representing more than 60 elderly victims of Heritage Financial Services and its related companies across 4 states. The case made national news within a week. Network of fake reverse mortgage companies targeted elderly homeowners, read the headline in USA Today. Small-town lawyer leads fight against elder fraud ring, reported the Washington Post. Diana found herself giving interviews to reporters and television news programs explaining how fraudulent reverse mortgage schemes worked and how elderly people could protect themselves. But she was careful to keep the focus on the victims rather than on herself. These companies prey on people who are grieving the loss of a spouse and facing financial uncertainty, Diana told a CNN reporter. They use official-looking documents and aggressive tactics to create fear and confusion. The goal is to steal people's homes and life savings. The publicity brought more victims forward. Within a month, Diana and her colleagues were representing over 200 people who had been targeted by Heritage Financial Services and related companies. But the publicity also brought Diana something unexpected. A call from her past that would force her to confront the reason she had left her legal career in the first place. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in March, 3 months after the Heritage Financial Services story had broken nationally. Diana was reviewing discovery documents when her assistant, Sarah, buzzed her on the intercom. "Diana, there's a woman online too who says she knows you from New York. She wouldn't give her name, but she said it was urgent." Diana hesitated. Very few people from her old life knew where she was or what she was doing. She had been careful to maintain her privacy when she moved to Riverside, and she had deliberately avoided contact with former colleagues and clients. But something about the urgency in Sarah's voice made her pick up the phone. "This is Diana Foster." "Diana, it's Catherine Walsh." Diana's blood ran cold. Catherine Walsh had been her partner at Morrison & Walsh, the law firm where Diana had worked for the last 10 years of her corporate career. More importantly, Catherine had been her closest friend and the only person who knew the real reason Diana had left legal practice. "Catherine," Diana said carefully, "how did you find me? The Heritage Financial Services case has been all over the legal news. When I saw your name, I couldn't believe it. Diana, we need to talk." "Catherine, if this is about coming back to the firm." "It's not about the firm," Catherine interrupted. "Diana, Michael Torino is getting out of prison next month." The name hit Diana like a physical blow. Michael Torino had been the subject of the last case Diana had worked on in New York, the case that had ended her career and changed her life forever. For a moment, she couldn't speak. "Diana, are you there?" "I'm here," Diana said quietly. "What does his release have to do with me?" "He's been making threats, saying he's going to find you and settle the score for what you did to him." "Diana, the FBI thinks he might be serious." Diana closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair. Michael Torino had been the CEO of a major pharmaceutical company that Diana had investigated for hiding dangerous side effects of a popular medication. Her investigation had led to criminal charges, a federal conviction, and a prison sentence for Torino. But it had also led to death threats against Diana and her family, threats serious enough that the FBI had recommended she enter witness protection. Instead, Diana had chosen to disappear on her own. She had changed her name back to her maiden name, moved to a small town where no one knew her, and tried to build a life without the constant fear that had consumed her final years in New York. "Catherine, that was 8 years ago. Why would he still care about me? Because your investigation didn't just send him to prison. It destroyed his company, cost him his fortune, and ruined his reputation. He spent 8 years in federal prison thinking about revenge." Diana looked out her office window at the quiet street below. 8 years of peace, 8 years of safety, 8 years of believing that her past would stay buried. Now it was all about to change. "What does the FBI want me to do?" "They want to meet with you." They want to discuss security measures and possible relocation. Diana thought about Harold Fletcher, about Susan Walsh, about the dozens of elderly clients who depended on her to protect them from financial predators. She thought about the network of attorneys she had built, the cases they were working on together, the lives they were saving. I can't leave, Catherine. I have clients, responsibilities. Diana, this isn't a game. Torino is dangerous. He has connections, resources. The FBI is taking this seriously. Then I'll take it seriously too, Diana said. But I'm not running again. After Diana hung up the phone, she sat in her office for a long time, staring at the Heritage Financial Services files spread across her desk. For 8 years, she had built a life based on helping people who couldn't help themselves. She had found purpose, meaning, and peace in fighting for justice on a smaller scale than her corporate career had allowed. Now, her past was threatening to destroy everything she had built. But Diana realized something as she sat there. She was not the same person who had fled New York 8 years earlier. That Diana had been afraid, isolated, overwhelmed by the threats against her and her family. This Diana had spent 3 years building a network of allies, fighting powerful enemies, and winning battles that protected vulnerable people. If Michael Torino wanted to threaten her, he would discover that Diana Foster was no longer someone who ran from fights. The next morning, Diana called Catherine Walsh back. I want to meet with the FBI, she said. But the meeting happens here, in Riverside. I'm not coming to New York. Diana, I don't think they'll agree to that. Then tell them that if they want my cooperation, they'll come to me. I have a law practice to run and clients to protect. 2 days later, Special Agent Jennifer Martinez of the FBI's New York office sat in Diana's conference room, reviewing security protocols and threat assessments. Agent Martinez was a woman in her 40s with short, dark hair and the kind of direct manner that Diana appreciated. Ms. Foster, Agent Martinez said, we have reason to believe that Michael Torino has been planning some form of retaliation against you since before his release. We've intercepted communications suggesting that he blames you personally for his conviction and imprisonment. What kind of retaliation? Diana asked. We're not sure. Possibly an attempt to harm you physically, but more likely some form of legal or financial attack designed to destroy your career or reputation. Diana thought about this for a moment. Agent Martinez. Michael Torino spent 8 years in federal prison because he ordered his company to hide evidence that their medication was causing heart attacks in elderly patients. Over 200 people died because of his decisions. I exposed the cover-up and testified at his trial. I'm not apologizing for that. We're not asking you to apologize, Agent Martinez said. We're asking you to take precautions to protect yourself. What kind of precautions? Agent Martinez opened a folder and spread several documents across the conference table. We recommend enhanced security measures for your home and office. We can arrange for periodic surveillance, and we strongly suggest you vary your daily routines. We also recommend that you consider temporarily relocating until we can assess the actual level of threat. Diana shook her head firmly. I'm not leaving Riverside. I have clients who depend on me, cases that can't be delayed, and a life I'm not willing to abandon because Michael Torino wants revenge. Ms. Foster, we understand your reluctance, but... Agent Martinez, let me ask you something. In your experience, do men like Torino usually give up and go away if their targets hide from them? Agent Martinez hesitated. Not typically, no. Then hiding won't solve the problem, it will just postpone it. Diana leaned forward. What would solve the problem is catching Torino in the act of doing something illegal and sending him back to prison where he belongs. You're suggesting we use you as bait? I'm suggesting that I continue doing exactly what I've been doing for the past 3 years, but with appropriate security measures and FBI surveillance. If Torino wants to come after me, let him try. Maybe this time he'll make a mistake that puts him away for life. Agent Martinez studied Diana's face for a long moment. Ms. Foster, this isn't a corporate lawsuit. If Torino decides to escalate to violence, then you'll be watching, and you'll stop him. Diana's voice was calm but determined. Agent Martinez, I spent 25 years fighting people like Michael Torino in courtrooms. I'm not afraid of him. But I am afraid of what happens to my clients if I abandon them. After Agent Martinez left, Diana called a meeting with her staff and explained the situation. Sarah, her assistant, was concerned but supportive. Tom Bradley, the attorney she had hired the previous year to help with the growing caseload, was more worried. Diana, maybe you should consider taking a sabbatical until this blows over, Tom said. I can handle the active cases, and we can refer new clients to other attorneys. Tom, how many cases are we handling right now? 47 active cases and about a dozen in the research phase. How many of those cases involve elderly clients who are being targeted by fraudulent companies? Tom checked his notes. 32. And how many of those clients do you think will get adequate representation if we refer them to other lawyers? Tom was quiet for a moment. Diana knew he understood the problem. Most attorneys didn't have the specialized knowledge or investigative resources needed to handle complex elder fraud cases. If Diana stopped taking these cases, many elderly victims would be left with inadequate legal help. Diana, I understand your commitment to these clients, but what good will it do them if something happens to you? Nothing is going to happen to me, Diana said firmly. The FBI is providing security, I'm taking precautions, and Michael Torino is a 64-year-old ex-convict with no money and no legitimate business connections. He's not as dangerous as he wants people to think. But even as Diana said those words, she knew she might be wrong. 3 weeks later, Diana's first indication that Torino was making his move came in the form of a lawsuit. Not against her personally, but against Harold Fletcher. The lawsuit was filed by a company called Atlantic Recovery Services, claiming that Harold owed $125,000 on a business loan his father had supposedly taken out in 1985. The documentation looked professional, the legal filing was proper, and the amount was large enough to force Harold into bankruptcy if he had to pay it. But Diana recognized the pattern immediately. The fake loan documents, the targeting of an elderly property owner, the demand for immediate payment. It was exactly the same scheme that Davidson and Associates had used, but with different company names and more sophisticated forgeries. Diana knew this wasn't a coincidence. Someone was targeting Harold Fletcher specifically because of his connection to her. She called Agent Martinez immediately. This is Michael Torino's work, Diana told the agent. He's using the same tactics that the companies I've been fighting have been using, but he's targeting my clients instead of random elderly victims. Can you prove the connection? Not yet, but I will. Agent Martinez, this is actually good news. Torino is committing fraud, and he's doing it in a way that creates a paper trail. If we can gather enough evidence, we can send him back to prison for financial crimes. Or he could disappear before we gather that evidence, leaving your clients to deal with fraudulent lawsuits. Diana smiled grimly. Then we'd better work fast. Over the next 2 weeks, Diana launched the most intensive investigation of her career. Working with Tom Bradley and 2 private investigators she hired, she traced the ownership of Atlantic Recovery Services through a maze of shell companies and false names. What she found was exactly what she had expected. Atlantic Recovery Services was owned by a company called Eastern Holdings, which was owned by another company called Metropolitan Investments, which was ultimately controlled by a trust fund that had been established by Michael Torino's wife, 1 month before his release from prison. But Diana also found something else. Atlantic Recovery Services had filed similar lawsuits against 6 other elderly property owners in 3 different states, all of them former clients of attorneys in Diana's network. Torino wasn't just targeting Diana. He was targeting her entire network of colleagues who specialized in elder fraud cases. Diana immediately called James Wright and the other attorneys in her network to warn them about the fraudulent lawsuits. What she learned was that the problem was even bigger than she had realized. "Diana, we've been hit with 12 different lawsuits in the past month," James Wright told her. "All from different companies, all claiming old debts from the 1980s and 1990s, all targeting our most vulnerable clients. Has anyone been able to trace the ownership of these companies?" "We've tried, but the paper trails are complex. It would take months and thousands of dollars to investigate each one properly." Diana realized that Torino's strategy was brilliant in its cruelty. By filing dozens of fraudulent lawsuits across multiple states, he was forcing Diana and her colleagues to spend all their time and resources defending their clients instead of taking on new elder fraud cases. Even if they eventually proved that all the lawsuits were fraudulent, the process would bankrupt some of their elderly clients and destroy the network's effectiveness. But Torino had made one crucial mistake. He had underestimated Diana's determination and resources. Diana spent the next 3 days preparing what she called Operation Cleanup. Working with Agent Martinez and the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, she developed a coordinated strategy to investigate all the fraudulent companies simultaneously and build a comprehensive criminal case against Michael Torino. The plan was ambitious. Diana and her network colleagues would continue defending their clients against the fraudulent lawsuits, but they would also gather evidence that could be used in a federal criminal prosecution. The FBI would provide investigative support and coordinate with federal prosecutors to build a case for organized financial fraud. But the plan also required something that Diana had never done before. She would have to go public with her identity and her past. "Ms. Foster," Agent Martinez explained, "if we're going to prosecute this as an organized conspiracy, we need to establish motive. That means we need to explain why Torino is targeting you and your colleagues specifically. We need to tell the story of your investigation into his pharmaceutical company." Diana understood the implications. For 8 years, she had carefully maintained her privacy and kept her past separate from her current life. Going public would mean that everyone in Riverside would learn who she really was and why she had come to their town. But it would also mean that Michael Torino's victims would get justice, and that elderly people across the region would be protected from his schemes. Diana made her decision on a Thursday afternoon in May, sitting in her office and looking out at the street where Harold Fletcher was sweeping the sidewalk in front of his hardware store. Harold had never asked her about her past, never questioned why she had been so effective at fighting Davidson and Associates, never demanded explanations for her skills or knowledge. He had simply trusted her to help him, and she had done so. Now, she would trust the people of Riverside to understand why she had come to their town and why she was fighting so hard to protect their neighbors. Diana called Agent Martinez and told her she was ready to go public. 2 days later, Diana stood in front of a room full of reporters at a press conference in the state capitol. Agent Martinez stood beside her, along with federal prosecutors and attorneys from Diana's network. "My name is Diana Foster," she began, "and 8 years ago, I was known as Diana Foster Martinez, a corporate attorney in New York who specialized in investigating pharmaceutical companies that hid dangerous side effects from patients and regulators." Diana told the story of her investigation into Torino's company, the evidence she had uncovered of the cover-up that led to hundreds of deaths, and the threats that had forced her to leave her career and start over in Riverside. She explained how Torino was now using fraudulent debt collection schemes to target her clients and colleagues in what she described as a campaign of revenge disguised as business litigation. But most importantly, she explained why she was telling this story now. Michael Torino believes that he can intimidate elderly victims and their attorneys by filing fraudulent lawsuits and hiding behind shell companies, Diana said. He believes that fear and confusion will allow him to steal people's homes and life savings while avoiding prosecution. Diana looked directly into the television cameras. He's wrong. We will not be intimidated. We will not stop fighting for our clients. And we will not allow him to prey on vulnerable elderly people in order to satisfy his desire for revenge. The press conference made national news that evening. Former corporate attorney emerges from hiding to fight elder fraud ring, reported CNN. Pharmaceutical executive's revenge plot targets small-town lawyer, read the headline in the New York Times. But for Diana, the most important response came from her clients and neighbors in Riverside. The next morning, when Diana arrived at her office, she found Harold Fletcher waiting for her with a cup of coffee and a determined expression. "Diana," he said, "I watched the news last night. I want you to know that it doesn't change anything. You helped me when I needed help, and that's all that matters." Throughout the day, Diana received similar messages from clients, neighbors, and friends. No one questioned her decision to keep her past private. No one criticized her for bringing danger to their community. Instead, they offered support and expressed admiration for her courage in fighting back against Torino. By evening, Diana realized that she had been wrong to worry about how people would react to learning about her past. The people of Riverside had come to know her through her actions, not her history. They trusted her because of what she had done for them, not because of who she had been. 2 weeks after the press conference, Michael Torino was arrested at his apartment in Newark, New Jersey. Federal agents found evidence of his involvement in over 40 fraudulent debt collection schemes across 6 states, targeting more than 200 elderly victims. The evidence included detailed records of the shell companies he had created, forged loan documents, and communications with associates who helped him file fraudulent lawsuits. But most damaging of all was a journal in which Torino had written about his plans to destroy Diana's career and reputation. "She cost me everything," one entry read. "Now I'll cost her everything. She wants to protect old people? I'll make sure she can't protect anyone." Diana testified at Torino's trial 6 months later. She explained how his fraudulent schemes had targeted her clients and colleagues, and how his desire for revenge had led him to prey on vulnerable elderly people across multiple states. The jury convicted Torino on all charges: organized fraud, elder abuse, identity theft, and conspiracy. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison, ensuring that he would be in his 80s before he was eligible for release. But for Diana, the most satisfying moment came when the judge addressed Torino directly before sentencing. "Mr. Torino," the judge said, "you spent 8 years in prison because you chose to prioritize profit over human life. Instead of learning from that experience, you chose to seek revenge by targeting some of the most vulnerable members of our society. Your actions demonstrate that you are incapable of rehabilitation and pose a continuing danger to the public." After the trial, Diana returned to Riverside and to her law practice. The publicity from the Torino case had brought her national recognition and offers from major law firms, but she turned them all down. She had found her place in the world, and it was not in a corporate boardroom or a prestigious law firm. It was in a small office above a bakery, fighting for people who needed someone to fight for them. The years following the Torino case brought new challenges and opportunities for Diana and her expanding practice. The national publicity had established her as one of the country's leading experts on elder fraud, and law enforcement agencies regularly consulted with her on complex cases involving financial exploitation of elderly victims. But Diana never forgot that her most important work happened on the individual level, one client at a time, one family at a time, one life saved from financial predators who counted on their victims being alone and afraid. 3 years after the Torino trial, Diana received a call that would test her skills in a completely different way. The caller was Detective Maria Santos of the Riverside Police Department, and she had an unusual request. "Ms. Foster," Detective Santos said, "we have a situation that requires someone with your expertise, but it's not exactly a legal matter. At least, not yet." Diana was intrigued. "What kind of situation?" "We've been investigating a series of thefts from elderly residents in town. Small amounts of money, jewelry, prescription medications. The pattern suggests someone who has access to these people's homes and knows their routines." "You think it's a caregiver or home health worker?" "That's our suspicion, but we can't prove it. The victims are all clients of the same home care agency, but they're also reluctant to cooperate with our investigation. They're afraid of losing their care services, and some of them aren't sure if they're actually being robbed or if they're just misplacing things." Diana understood the problem immediately. Elderly people who depended on home care services were particularly vulnerable to theft and exploitation, but they were also afraid to report problems that might result in losing the help they needed to remain in their homes. "What do you need from me?" Diana asked. "We need someone who knows how to talk to elderly victims, someone they trust. We need someone who can help us understand what's really happening and build a case that will protect these people." Diana agreed to help, but she had conditions. "Detective Santos, if we're going to do this right, we need to approach it as a comprehensive investigation. We need to look not just at theft, but at all forms of potential abuse or exploitation. And we need to make sure that any victims we identify get the support and protection they need." Over the next 2 months, Diana worked closely with Detective Santos and social services agencies to investigate what turned out to be a sophisticated theft and fraud operation run by several employees of the home care agency. The investigation revealed that the thieves had been systematically targeting elderly clients who lived alone and had cognitive impairments that made them less likely to notice missing items or remember who had access to their homes. The stolen items were small enough to go unnoticed initially: $20 from a purse, a single piece of jewelry, a few prescription pills. But over time, the thefts had added up to thousands of dollars in losses for each victim, and the prescription drug thefts had left some elderly clients without necessary medications. Diana's role in the investigation was crucial. Her experience with elder fraud cases had taught her how to interview elderly victims in a way that helped them feel safe and supported, rather than interrogated. She knew how to ask questions that elicited accurate information without making victims feel confused or ashamed. More importantly, Diana understood the legal framework needed to protect elderly victims and ensure that they could get justice without losing access to necessary care services. The investigation led to the arrest of 3 home care workers and the discovery of a network that was stealing from elderly clients across multiple counties. The arrests also led to reforms in how home care agencies screened employees and monitored client services. But for Diana, the most important outcome was the creation of a new program that provided legal advocacy for elderly victims of crime and exploitation. Working with local law enforcement and social services agencies, Diana helped establish a system that ensured elderly victims had access to both legal representation and ongoing support services. The program became a model that was adopted by communities across the state, and Diana found herself traveling regularly to train law enforcement officers, social workers, and attorneys on how to effectively investigate and prosecute crimes against elderly victims. 5 years after the Torino case, Diana Foster was 67 years old and running one of the most respected elder law practices in the region. Her office above the bakery had expanded to include 2 other attorneys and a paralegal who specialized in financial fraud cases, but Diana had also opened a second office in the state capital to better serve clients across the region. But Diana's most important work remained the same as it had always been: fighting for people who needed someone to fight for them. On a quiet Tuesday morning in October, exactly 8 years after the day she had first seen Harold Fletcher arguing with lawyers outside his hardware store, Diana sat in her original Riverside office reviewing files from her latest case. A company in another state was trying to claim ownership of a family farm using tactics similar to those employed by Davidson and Associates and Heritage Financial Services years earlier. Diana had learned that fraudulent schemes evolved and adapted, but they always targeted the same vulnerabilities: people who were isolated, grieving, or unfamiliar with complex legal processes. The schemes relied on victims' fear of the legal system and their reluctance to fight back against official-looking documents and aggressive tactics. But Diana had also learned something else over the past 8 years. When victims had someone willing to fight for them, the fraudulent schemes collapsed quickly. The companies behind these schemes counted on their victims being alone and afraid. They didn't expect to face experienced attorneys who knew how to investigate, how to gather evidence, and how to expose their tactics in court and in the media. As Diana worked on her latest case, she reflected on the path that had brought her back to legal practice. She had spent 8 years trying to escape her past as a corporate attorney, believing that her old life had been about winning rather than justice. But helping Harold Fletcher had shown her that the skills she had developed could be used to protect rather than to profit, to defend rather than to attack. The threat from Michael Torino had forced her to confront her past and integrate it with her present. She was no longer running from who she had been or trying to pretend she was someone else. She was Diana Foster, a woman who had used her skills to fight powerful enemies in corporate boardrooms and small-town courtrooms, who had faced down death threats and fraudulent lawsuits, and who had never stopped believing that everyone deserved someone who would fight for them when they couldn't fight for themselves. Outside her office window, she could see Harold Fletcher opening his hardware store for another day of business. Harold was 86 now, moving a little slower, but still running his store with the same quiet pride he had always shown. The store was busier than it had been 8 years ago, serving not just Riverside, but several surrounding communities. Harold had become one of Diana's closest friends, and she often stopped by the store just to chat and to remind herself why her work mattered. He had never asked her for details about her past, never questioned her decisions, never demanded explanations for her choices. He had simply accepted her help when he needed it and offered his friendship in return. Their relationship had taught Diana something important about trust and community. People didn't need to know your entire history to value your contributions. They didn't need to understand your past to appreciate your present. What mattered was what you did for them when they needed help, not who you had been before they met you. The phone on Diana's desk rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller was a woman named Elizabeth Turner, calling from a town about 90 miles away. "Ms. Foster," Elizabeth said, "I heard you help people who are being targeted by companies with fake legal documents. I think someone is trying to steal my mother's house, and the local lawyers say there's nothing we can do." Diana reached for a notepad and pen. "Tell me what happened, Elizabeth." As she listened to Elizabeth's story, Diana felt the familiar combination of anger and determination that had driven her through hundreds of cases over the past 8 years. Another fraudulent company, another scheme targeting a vulnerable elderly person, another family facing the loss of their home and their security. But Diana also felt something else: confidence. Confidence in her abilities, confidence in her network of colleagues, and confidence in the system of justice that she had spent her career defending and improving. Diana spent the next 20 minutes listening to Elizabeth describe how a company called Patriot Asset Recovery had contacted her 89-year-old mother, claiming that she owed $90,000 on a loan that supposedly dated back to 1988. The company had official-looking documents and had already filed papers to begin foreclosure proceedings on the family farm where Elizabeth's mother had lived for over 50 years. "Ms. Foster," Elizabeth said, her voice shaking with emotion, "my mother has never borrowed money against that farm. My father paid it off in 1985, and we have the documents to prove it. But this company says their papers are more recent and take precedence." Diana recognized the pattern immediately. It was the same scheme she had seen dozens of times before, but with different company names and slightly modified tactics. Fraudulent debt collectors had learned to adapt their methods based on previous prosecutions, but they always relied on the same fundamental approach: target vulnerable elderly property owners with fake debt claims and use aggressive legal tactics to force quick settlements. "Elizabeth, I want you to know that you and your mother are not alone in this," Diana said. "This is a common scam, and there are ways to fight it. Can you bring your mother and all the documents to my office tomorrow morning?" "Ms. Foster, we live almost 100 miles away. My mother doesn't travel well anymore." "Then I'll come to you," Diana said without hesitation. "Elizabeth, your mother's farm and her security are more important than my convenience. I'll drive out tomorrow morning and we'll figure this out together." As Diana hung up the phone, she realized that this moment represented everything she had learned about the practice of law over the past 8 years. It wasn't about billing hours or prestigious clients or high-profile cases. It was about being willing to drive 100 miles to sit at an elderly woman's kitchen table and explain to her that she didn't have to lose her home to people who were trying to steal it with forged documents. Diana had spent 25 years fighting for justice in corporate boardrooms where millions of dollars were at stake. But she had learned that the most important justice happened on a smaller scale. One elderly person at a time, one family farm at a time, one home saved from fraudulent debt collectors who counted on their victims being too afraid or too isolated to fight back. "Don't worry, Elizabeth," Diana had said. "I know exactly how to handle people like that." And she did. After 8 years of fighting fraudulent debt collectors, predatory lenders, and financial scammers who targeted elderly victims, Diana Foster had become exactly what she was meant to be: someone who fought for people who needed someone to fight for them, someone who used her skills to protect rather than to profit, someone who understood that the most important battles weren't always the biggest ones. Diana Foster was 67 years old, and she was exactly where she belonged. In a small office above a bakery in a town that had become her home, answering phone calls from people who didn't know where else to turn, and promising them that they were not alone in their fight for justice. The quiet woman who had once tried to disappear had instead become a force for protection and justice, proving that it's never too late to find your purpose, never too late to use your skills for something meaningful, and never too late to fight back against those who prey on the vulnerable. Diana Foster had spent decades learning how to fight. Now she had spent years learning how to fight for the right reasons. And she would continue fighting, one case at a time, for as long as people needed someone who knew how to fight for them. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.